Welcome back to the Wise Up Podcast, your weekly dose of business wisdom from the members of Open Water. I am your host, Chris Albrecht, and I am feeling like a phony today. No, not
No.
really. But we are going to be tackling kind of a serious subject, I think. I'm talking with Delida Costin. She's a general counsel growth advisor, but she's much more complicated than that. So first, welcome to the show, Delida.
Oh, thank you so much, Chris, to you and to the entire Open Water community. I'm really excited to be here.
Well, we're excited to have you here. And I said being a phony because we're going to talk about like imposter syndrome today, but we're not going to talk about it sort of in the way that we're used to talking about it, right? Like just because I feel like a phony, we're talking about something different. It's something much deeper, something more systemic. We're going to talk about being a defiant imposter. And I think this is a really timely discussion and a really important one. But before we begin, tell me a little bit about your professional journey. And so how you came to the concept of being a defiant imposter?
Yeah, I'd love to tell you about it. It first started for me a long time ago when I was a very early associate in a law firm. And one of those meetings in the conference room, there are tons and tons of people sitting around a big table and we're eating lunch and something important was going on. And I don't remember what it was now. But at the end of the meeting, I got up and I started to clear the table. I just started to pick up the dishes and take them over to the sideboard. I had friends on the catering staff. It's probably important to say that I was a young lawyer at the time. And the managing partner came over to me and said, "Stop doing that." And I was like, "It's no big deal. I don't mind. It's fine. I have friends on catering staff. We're just hanging out. We're chilling." And she pulled me aside and she told me, "Delida, you are a young Black woman in a firm in an industry that doesn't see very many of you. And it seems to me that you need to really find ways to overcome some of the structural stereotypes that people are going to have for what you can do and what you can be. And the trick here is that you're also a very junior associate, and your job is to answer phones and get the faxes and answer doors. But you need to find a way to do that so that you can participate in the ecosystem of junior associatehood and learn what you need to learn. But you also need to make sure that you're doing it in a way that doesn't reinforce stereotypes for your capability and your ability to succeed. And that will be the trick for you. And it was advice at the time that was so striking because there was no conversation around DEIB at that time. There was nothing of that sort. And it was something that was initiated by the partner at a firm, top down to me, the most high level to the most junior person. And she just really had me thinking from that moment on about what I could be doing. And as I went further in my career, the question became, how could I continue to find ways to open doors and help other people navigate those paths also? So that's a little bit about how I started to think about it.
So there's a lot to unpack there, right? Which is, now listen, I'm a middle-aged white dude. So, my perceptions and my journey through the world is much different than what yours was. And I'm wondering, yes, it was striking at the time, but can you give me a sense of like how you started to unpack that? Because on one level, you could see it as like, yes, you know, sort of, I belong here. This is, I'm an associate. I went to law school. I should be doing this kind of work. And then there's another part where you're just like, well, I'm just kind of helping out. You know what I mean?
Just
Like
clearing dishes.
I worked at a restaurant, my mom told me to, clean up after myself. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But that's obviously different between your journey and mine. Right. So I'm just wondering like just how because I think this really helps set the stage for how you talk about Defying Imposter and sort of like, yes, that advice was striking, but how did you begin to sort of unpack that and then apply it the next day and the next week and the next month?
Yeah. It was really interesting, Chris, because at the moment I was so taken aback because there was a big part of me that really believed I'm Delida, I'm a lawyer, I just happen to be Black. But she really started to break down these rules around systemic oppressions or systemic structures that are very hard to escape. And it took me some time to be able to really see how those systemic structures come into play. Another example was being invited early on to a golf tournament or a golf game. I don't even know what they're called. I never played golf again, by a partner. And he invited three of us, three associates, to his country club in order to thank us for work we had done well. We got there and we realized that women weren't allowed on the green before noon. And so it's those kind of systemic structures that are in place that, sometimes people can go past them. There's a green light. And for sometimes some of us, there's a red light. And so for me, I had to really start to learn to really pay attention to what would be some of the barriers or the obstacles. And I put on a little bit of an undercover agent. I started to really like James Bond. And I was like, if James Bond can do it, I can do it too. So
So then now I've at the risk of being rude, there's
oh,
been a lot
please.
of time between that moment, right? Those moments when you were a junior associate and now where you are much senior in the legal
Yeah.
sense, in the legal
Yeah.
infrastructure sense, right? So how did you get from that moment to sort of creating and crafting this idea of a defiant imposter? Because it
Yeah.
seemed like you went from like one, just the news struck you, and then you're sort of rethinking it, right? And it's almost like a reactive kind of thing. But over time, it seems like you've moved into more of an active role, right?
Right.
Like it is now you're getting ahead of it by being a defiant imposter. So tell me how you're sort of defining in Defiant Imposter and how you reached that um
Yeah.
that term.
A lot of it came from more of the talk around imposter syndrome. Imposter syndrome is something that so many of us can relate to. And it comes about for all different kinds of reasons when we're in a new situation and we're learning or we're uncomfortable. I think there are lots of reasons for why it's become so ubiquitous in our discussions today. But what I was really more interested in, especially when I ran an HR department, I've been a general counsel and I've also been a chief people officer. And I started to see examples of people showing up and saying, this isn't necessarily about belonging only. This is also about creating change within a company. It's not necessarily about how I feel. I actually know that I'm competent. I actually know that I belong here, but I need help in navigating other people's expectations of what I can do. And in working through that with people, sometimes it really is a matter of skills. Like, you think that you've got the skills that you really don't have. And so let's double down and make your skills better. But sometimes it's really been about you're not going to be able to change that person's perspective about women or about moms or about, whatever issues or implicit biases that are there. In a perfect world, we would want that to happen, but that's a long way from getting to the reality where we are today. So what are the things that you can do today to overcome the obstacles that people are throwing up at you because you are in a group that is often excluded?
All right, so let's dive into that, right?
Yeah.
What are some strategies that you have either developed that you have developed yourself or seen in others that you sort of help people implement to sort of embrace the idea of defiant imposter and overcome it?
Yeah. One of the things that I've seen and that has been really helpful for me is you can't get angry. You can't get mad. When you're in a situation and you believe that there is some kind of systemic force that's working against you, it's really important to stay cool and be calm and think about what are the structural issues that are at play there and not necessarily attacking people, because people don't necessarily, I mean, that partner didn't know that women weren't allowed on the green, not necessarily. He didn't set out to do anything wrong. But it's really about how do you navigate that situation? As a more senior person in the legal field now, I probably would have said, well, none of us are going to play golf today, right? Like we're
Yeah.
all going to go nurse our cokes by the pool. I didn't know how to do that when I was more junior. So there are ways to kind of attack the systemic barriers that are thrown up. Another way to kind of navigate that is just to observe what's the right behavior or what behaviors are valued and what skills are valued, and then to really try to take those on yourself. and to really deliver results. It's really important to continue to deliver results in those situations, and not necessarily spend too much time thinking about how things aren't fair and overcoming that. It's really important to double down and think about what's valued and deliver that value.
So do you think that you, much like you had a moment back in your junior associate days, do you think you've delivered that moment to someone else? And if so, how did you deliver it? And did you in that moment know that you were sort of delivering the same advice? Was it as stark, do you think, or did you change it up?
You know, I think it's different now because we can talk about it differently. So there are moments in my career and as I'm leading my teams where I might say, this is how I'm going to approach this because of my background. I am a Black woman. I am thinking about these things, but you on my team might not be thinking about that. So let's unpack the best way for you to persuade or deliver the message that you need to deliver. So I will talk about it and I will think about myself, and I will point attention to myself. And I make it a little bit more of a regular conversation. And, I believe that in doing so, it makes it much easier for everybody to talk about it as well, talk about those scenarios as well.
So how do you think it has changed since you got that? And I don't mean to like just hang this
Yeah.
on the advice that you got like back in in your junior associate days. I don't but what I'm curious about is, one of the things is just this idea of belonging and, inclusion and equity and all of these things, right? They're relatively new ideas in the corporate world. They're certainly not things that we talked about at the beginning of my
No.
career, right? And so I'm curious as to how you have seen sort of the defying you as a defiant imposter back in your 20s is probably you different than you as a defiant imposter now. And so I'm wondering, as you look across generations, how is it the same message or sort of how are you delivering? I know you have a TED talk and we should say that you have a TED talk coming up
Right.
on August 8th, correct?
August 7th. That's right.
August 7th, right? Sorry. That's all about being a defiant imposter. But sort of, have you thought about ways of how you deliver this message and how you might tailor it to different audiences?
Yeah. One of the things that I say to people is that, and maybe I started to say it here, you may have imposter syndrome, but it's also okay to be an imposter. And so, one of the differences between imposter syndrome and what I think of as a defiant imposter is that imposter syndrome are those internal feelings of feeling like a fraud, of feeling like we don't belong, despite the evidence that we do and that we're competent and we're capable. When you're an imposter, you actually know that you're competent. You know that you're capable. You've got the background. You've reached a certain level in your career. You've got the confidence to go out and do the work that you need to do, but you're dismissed or your contributions are devalued, or there are systemic reasons why people question whether or not you should be there. And we're seeing it a little bit more and more. We hear about DEI hires and diversity hires. And that's not meant to be a good thing always. People will use those words to put people down, and make folks question whether or not they really belong in the room, and make other people question whether or not the folks that message is targeted towards belong in the room. So what's changed for me is that I'm okay now saying in certain structures, I may be an imposter. I may be an imposter. And that's okay. It is okay to exist in a world that isn't fair, and to exist in a world and want to be successful in a world that isn't necessarily structured for your ease and belonging. And the trick is to embrace that, understand your place, and still get the job done and keep your eyes on the prize. So in my mind, that's a little bit of a difference. I was younger and I used to just want to belong. And now I want to belong by doing good work. But I also realize that, Chris, you and I might not always belong in the same way. You and I probably are going to belong in a lot of the same ways, but there are going to be places where the belonging or the commonalities are going to diverge.
So what I'm curious about is sort of the forces at play here, right? And I
Yeah.
know, so one, Defiant Imposter seems to talk, it seems to be around the idea of systemic things, right? External forces acting in towards you. And then imposter syndrome, just as it's normally used, is sort of an inward and how you are feeling reflected out, right?
That's right.
And so I'm wondering, again, as you are sort of you are a mentor to people or you help them, right? Like if someone can, like, I feel like at some point maybe you double dipped, right? Like you
Oh, tell
maybe you
me.
had imposter syndrome and were a defiant
Probably.
imposter.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? And so
Yeah.
when talking with people like that, right? Like, do you feel like, do people need to sort of I'm just trying to how you might recommend for somebody who's feeling both of those things, right? I don't know if
Yeah.
that's come up, but you're just like, hey, you're not an imposter, and now there are these things outside of you that you just need to understand exist. Or I'm just curious as to how you might deal with the double dipping issue.
Yeah, I think that the one thing that's the most important to keep in mind is that if you don't move forward in the direction that you want to go, you're not necessarily ever going to move. You have to try. You have to have perseverance and courage and resilience. So, for folks who are dealing with kind of the really complicated confluence that you're talking about of maybe being an imposter and feeling like you don't belong all at the same time, one of the things to stop and think about is just you know your own worth. You know how hard you've worked. You know the kind of work that you've done. You know the kind of work that folks around you are doing. So, in thinking through any internal feelings of whether or not you belong, like just look around the room and chances are that you're doing just as well or better, so possibly, than the other folks in the room. And so you may feel it, but you don't have to act on it. You put that feeling aside, you have the evidence, you collect the evidence by observing. And then as you're thinking through, well, why is this a little bit different for me? Why am I not able to act in the same way or behave in the same way that others behave and get the same results? It really is about exploring and finding the right way to showcase your own strengths and your own talents in a way that other folks will appreciate. And that becomes the work as opposed to the work of bolstering your confidence. I think that lots of times we can spend a lot of time trying to bolster our confidence, but that's not always going to be as useful if you really are a true imposter as figuring out how to navigate and moving.
Okay. So how can individuals sort of navigate systemic exclusion while maintaining their authenticity and striving for success, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think the first thing is just to recognize that the world isn't fair. And we are doing a lot of good work right now in DEIB. There's a lot of conversations around belonging. There are a lot more conversations going on in corporate America about inclusion, and all of that is great, but it's not always going to arrive for every single person in the moment that they need it. So I think that there's two things to do. I'm speaking to like imposters and folks maybe who aren't. For folks who are in those situations where there are systemic exclusionary forces acting on them, it's okay to acknowledge it and to say, I'm going to go as far as I can and navigate and get help in how to navigate. Find the people around you or in your circles, or maybe even outside of your circles, who have dealt with certain kinds of scenarios before and get help. There's lots of general counsel forums. There are lots of, essentially ERGs within industries that you can tap into. So tap in and find the ways that folks have navigated before you. And then if you're somebody who's a leader who is looking at somebody on your team who maybe is being evaluated unfairly or looked at unfairly, sometimes it's okay to even acknowledge that to yourself and to the person. But as a leader, it's also incumbent upon all of us to clear the decks for that person. To the extent that there are going to be obstacles, those obstacles should be fair obstacles. And to the extent that we know and we see that people may be being evaluated differently, it's important for us to speak up and help to clear those decks for those folks who are reporting into us and who are in our own ecosystem.
So when you talk about defiant imposter, how are you trying to reach, or who are you trying to reach? Are you trying to reach sort of the employee? We'll just say like the
Yeah.
employee, or are you trying to reach the leader? And If so, what do you want them to take away from sort of, what should each of those people take away from your TED talk?
Yeah. I think for the imposter, the defiant imposter, you are an defiant because you recognize and you acknowledge that you are an imposter. There's no syndrome associated with it. The things that sometimes are stopping you maybe are internal. Maybe you need more skills. Maybe you've got a confidence issue. Maybe there's imposter syndrome, but quite possibly there are also external forces acting on you as well. And in those cases, it's important to recognize that and navigate through that with intention and calmness and a bit of grace for where you can get to and what you can accomplish. And then I think for the leaders, it's also important to recognize it as well. And you can, as a one person, impact somebody's career trajectory or life without needing a very full-blown DEI program behind you. If you see something, it's okay to be able to say it and clear the decks and create pathways for people who might not otherwise have them.
What do you say then to people who are sort of in between, right? So do you have the person who is the defiant imposter? You have sort of a leader who is helping nurture that, but they're in a position of power. But then you have, I guess we would call them just like coworkers, right?
Yeah.
What steps should they take to sort of, I don't, recognize defiant imposter is probably not the right phrase, but do you see what I'm saying? Like,
Yeah.
how do they help everyone navigate this idea?
I think one of the things that everybody can do, including peers and colleagues who are not necessarily in a different power differential to you, or to somebody in that situation, is just to be able to have the conversation. So if somebody comes to you and says, I'm feeling a little bit of some kind of way, and I'm wondering if it's because I'm a woman or I'm a person of color, it's okay to ask somebody, well, tell me why you believe that. Tell me a little bit about what you're experiencing and help the person who comes to you to unpack that and unpack that belief and that feeling. I think validating the experience is very, very important. And from doing that kind of conversation or engaging in that kind of conversation, you may just help somebody figure out the right way to move. And you yourself as a peer may also find yourself in a position to help somebody else because you've had an exchange of ideas and hopefully you've learned.
What do you think the role? Well, I guess it might be kind of obvious, right? But it seems
Yeah.
like empathy just plays a huge role in this, right? Like the ability to sort of put yourself in someone else's shoes.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering how you view whether, it's in companies, empathy probably is, it's not the companies there to make money, right? But how do you establish, do you have tools or like ideas or thoughts around helping establish empathy so that you aren't just looking at the world through your own lens? And I probably mean this as people who might be probably the people around people who are like the defiant imposter, right?
Yeah.
Like that's what it seems like. I don't know if I'm pulling at the wrong thread there, but
I think it's true for everybody, imposters and non-imposters. I mean, the first question to ask, I think, is tell me more about that. Tell me more about why you feel that way. Tell me more about what you're seeing. We have tools and we have methodologies that we think about, which is approaching with curiosity. We want to ask questions, and I think that's a really great way to engage with somebody. These are really potentially touchy areas to talk about. And so folks may not feel free or feel safe or comfortable raising them. But if somebody does have the courage to raise it, I think it's really important not to become too defensive and to just kind of, even if you're feeling defensive, to sort of just say, tell me more about that. Explain a little bit more about that. And then really try to listen to that perspective and put yourself in the other person's shoes. And I think that goes for both sides.
I want to ask a very sort of tactical question,
Yeah.
right? Which is if you are feeling like a defiant imposter, and because you're a lawyer, like do these conversations, do they originate in email so that you have like a record of them? or do they originate? Do you say are they a face-to-face kind of thing, or do
Oh,
you have any sense?
interesting.
I mean, I realize that it is very case by case, right? But I'm curious as to, what we've talked a lot about today is starting conversations. And I'm wondering if in your experience, the best way to start that conversation is doing it in person, or do you want like, do you know what I mean? Like, what's the
Yeah.
best way?
The fact that I'm a lawyer, it's interesting. I don't go to the first place of liability. So when I think about starting something in writing and having a record, it's to protect you or the employee or the company. I don't think that's the right mindset. In my mind, the right way to do this is to find out how to have a conversation face to face. And if you can't have a conversation face to face with the person that you want to have a better relationship with, you find another group of people to have that conversation with. But mostly it's not as though, Chris and I are in conflict. You and
Yeah.
I are participating in a system that is bigger than us. It was set before you were born and before I was born. And we're living with kind of the downstream, generational downstream of that. So I'm not going to be mad at you. That's not the right place to go. The right place to have the conversation is to say, Chris, like, it's really interesting that, this group has this many people in it, but not this kind of people in it. And, what do we think about that? How are we gonna do something about that? What should we be thinking? Where should our outreach be? Where should our conversation go? What communities do we want to impact? That's the kind of conversation that I think we should be having. And that's not something that is a gotcha or something that can protect us or even be a spear for legal action.
Okay. My apologies. My father was a
No, it's
lawyer, so I
fine.
see liabilities
Yeah,
everywhere
no,
in my life.
there is liability
Everything
everywhere.
is everything is fraught for me. But that's a different. You're not my therapist, so we don't need to go into
Well,
that right now.
maybe I should be. I don't know.
All right. Well, I want to talk a little bit about your TED Talk, right? So
Yeah.
it's happening August 7th. What can people expect from that? We've sort of talked a little bit about it today, but what can people expect from tuning into your talk?
Oh, I'm so glad that you asked that question. I think that my main message is to try to deliver in that moment in my TED Talk, a message to folks who are feeling as though they are at the crossroads of external exclusionary forces. And I want to be able to leave folks with a little bit of a path forward on how do you navigate that. But even more importantly, I just want to open up the discussion because I believe that we sometimes tell people that they're suffering from imposter syndrome when they actually are imposters. They actually are experiencing external forces. And I want that to stop. I want us to be able to get to a place where we're able to have a conversation about competence and ability and stereotypes and things that may hold all of us back and the systems in which we all participate. In a way that we just haven't been able to do or we haven't done as well in corporate America.
All right. Well, Delida Costin, thank you so much for being on the
Thank
show
you,
today. We
Chris.
really appreciate this. We look forward to your TED Talk. We'll leave that in the show notes so people can visit it. But thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank you, Chris. I really appreciate it.